Welcome to Walking the Virtual Dog. I'm Rick Grant, and this is the show where we take a step back, we take our virtual dogs for a walk, and really think about the IT analysts. No, we think about the IT industry through the eyes of the IT analysts. Now, to help us make sense of that, we have veteran industry analyst relations. And this is the one we're going to mess up, Tom.
No, you're fine. Let's keep going, man. You're doing good. I got to tell you, we think about a lot of things, Rick. All the time. We think about IT. We think about generative AI. We think about security. We think about analysts. We think about the world and what's happening. Everything is connected.
Yes. Well, I'm going to turn it over to you and talk to us now about what's connected right now.
All right. Well, there's a lot of things to talk about today. So we're going to cover off on a couple of things that are important. And we've talked about some of the cautionary tales of generative AI and some of the problems that generative AI has created, and also this assumption that, everything's going to work here. It kind of reminds me, Rick, of whenever we have the old story of the consultant who walks into every situation with a hammer looking for a nail. It's going to require a lot of thought processes on all of our parts collectively. And I'm not just talking about government regulations or, for that matter, industry or even society in general. Let's not also forget about the fact that many of the things that have been created are the result of the academic community as well. So the academic community also has to weigh in on this. But we've talked about all these warnings and all these things to look out for. How about if we talk about some optimistic things about AI and what AI is creating for us? And for that, we turn to an article, a really nice article that was written by Marilee Kern for Business Gada. So literally, I look at this stuff from all over the world. So sometimes the best ideas come from across the pond, and some of the best perspectives come from across that way. And that's exactly what this was. It was worth looking at because the title of the article, and I'm just going to speak to it, Rick, we're not going to show any charts for this at the moment, but 5 AI trends profoundly benefiting business bottom lines. So in other words, there are some trends taking place, and they are helping businesses to achieve their revenues and their objectives. And I'm just going to mention these 5 AI trends. I'm just going to talk to them because this is not a delineation from the analysts or a deductions from the analysts, but we do have some quotes about the analyst community that were included in Marilee Kern's article. So the number one thing is it's manifesting new marketing opportunities. New market opportunities are resulting. And essentially, the reason for that is, let's just lift up the hood on AI for just a moment. And Marilee Kern makes this example when she says that with COVID-19 as one recent example, algorithms speedily sifted through an extraordinary amount of data to identify diseases and potential cures that presented as similar, which allowed those methodologies to be readily tested against the coronavirus. Well, we weren't able to do this before now. But the point is, if we can do this for COVID-19, what else can we do it for? We can take the same emerging AI processing protocols and we can put in far more rapid and prior iterations than we could with machine learning technology as it was only 5 years ago. Number 2, reconcile emotions with actualities. I love the fact that we can look at data now and we can look at it and it's counterintuitive. But Kern sums it up a little bit better in her article when she says data generates value, which leads to the generation of money. She says it's that simple. Well, that's true. What we can start to do now with data is create whole new opportunities, and we can certainly look at reconciling emotions with actualities. What would be the best functioning way for our borders to be open or closed? What would be the best functioning way for us to manage labor issues and labor disputes? What would be the most efficient way? Can we take the emotions out of the picture? Can we take all the triggers out, and can we just simply look at the data? Let the data generate the value. Let the data show us new processes. 2 or 3, scale statistical models for actionable models. So in other words, we're no longer looking at just factuals about this is what happened. Now we can actually look and see what's the human decision-making process to those factuals. Are we coming to these conclusions in an illogical way? Is it possible for us to take a look at a statistical model and turn it into action? Kern points this out. Technology is now allowing us to understand trends on a factual level and then project outward. In the health realm, some companies are using this key learning to project whether or not a person is likely to suffer a certain affliction, right? So we're actually looking at predictive modeling in this case. We weren't able to look at predictive modeling to the level of detail or the level of impact that we are today. Not only about health, but what about the environment? What about sustainability? What about a whole bunch of other factors that we could look at on a macro level that we couldn't look at before, and we can actually make some viable projections. Next, future-proof anti-fragile data supply chains. Now, we talked a little bit about this in the last segment. The supply chains, we've experienced a lot as a result of COVID, and one of them was supply chain breakdown. Is it possible for us to take a look at data supply chains and make changes there too? Kern points this out: from data connectors to pipelines, data lakes to statistical models, AI to quantum, visual storyboards to data-driven automation, and from ML and NLP to neural networks, because we all talked about neural networks and more. They're highly effective methods of future-proofing your data value chain. So in other words, let's take a look at the supply chain, see how we can make things better. And the final one, number 5, is multimedia monetization. Now we can actually take all of the knowledge and the intellectual property that's been created by an organization for years, and we can begin to put it in multimedia channels and aspects. I don't know about you, Rick, but whenever I need to fix a washer or a dryer or do something to my furnace, I usually go and I check out whatever YouTube it is. I've pulled up all kinds of things: how to tow a car, how to fix a problem or a mechanical issue. We now can do all these things, but we can also, as organizations, we can go even higher. So we have the capability, as Kern points out, that the applications for processing of visual and auditory inputs are endless. This was a great article. I will have the link in our newsletter, and you'll be able to pull that up on your own if you're interested in more detail. And I'll just include the final quote, and you can show the screen for this if you don't mind, Rick, which is this. She does quote an analyst in the process of summarizing this particular pathway of understanding the potentials of generative AI. And that is to innovate their way beyond the post-COVID-19 world. Data and analytics leaders require an ever-increasing velocity and scale of analysis in terms of processing and access to succeed in the face of unprecedented market shifts. And that comes from, of course, Rita Salam, who's a distinguished vice president and analyst at Gartner. So, Rick, we're on the move. Talk about a lot of things to think about. You know what? Generative AI is here to stay.
Well, that's a lot of positive ideas behind that. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, I want to highlight in this particular segment a guest-written article by Enza Yiannopoulos, who's the principal analyst at Forrester, and she wrote this for CDO Trends in April 25th of 2023. And this is about the problems that have come up for generative AI and some guidelines to work around it. So we're going to go through these guidelines for generative AI that Yiannopoulos put together, and we'll see if we can create some of our own conclusions from this. But let me start out with the preamble of the issue and what Yiannopoulos points out. ChatGPT, which we're all becoming familiar with, and it's somewhat of a generative AI poster child, although there are literally hundreds of new applications in the generative AI space that are being created and released every single day by various companies and programmers. It's in trouble with privacy. And part of an open investigation of the Italian regulator stopped the use of ChatGPT in Italy. This has hit the news recently. And according to the regulator, GPT fails to inform users about personal data that it collects and it processes. So the big question is, where does this go from here? And also, it doesn't support minors' consent, which is extremely important on the internet, as we all know, because we don't want 8-year-olds playing with violent games or watching inappropriate or using inappropriate materials. So the analyst from Forrester had some guidelines that we want to go through and we want to discuss. And basically, these are considered to be absolutely musts when it comes to addressing issues. And it talks about third parties, it talks about governance matters, talks about security risks, and all, as well as the other risks that come with it. So let's just go right on into the guidelines. First, number one, assessed whether personal identifiable information is in scope. Existing data flow maps will provide a first indication, and record processing activities should also tell whether generative AI is using personal identifiable information. But if we're using that kind of information, it's important for the users and for the organization provider. It has to ask for the provider to run a scan on the systems, acquire more accurate information about, and this is called personal identifiable information, is actually called PII, going into the generative AI systems. And if it's in scope, well, that's the part of the challenge. Number two, complete a data protection impact assessment. Up to this point, we have a lot of discussions within and a lot of dialogue around security assessments, cyber resiliency assessments. Those types of assessments are much more of the nuts and bolts side of this. Now we've got to transfer that same methodology of looking at this from a standpoint of generative AI. So in other words, you've got to look at it not only on the infrastructure as a service side, but also the platform as a service side. The assessment will help identify risks pertaining to the activities in which the systems engage. So in other words, what systems are using the information and in what way is the data still impacted whenever the information is being used? And we're talking about substantial volumes of data that's processed and collected. That was the biggest concern coming from the Italian regulators. It certainly will become more of a concern for other organizations as well and other government entities as we can continue to see proliferation of generative AI. Number three, verify that you rely on the appropriate legal basis for the collection and processing of the personal data that goes into generative AI systems. Now we're talking about GDPR here. Do you have access to this information, and can you communicate with the data in such a way, and I'm talking about personal data like personal emails, business emails, and so forth, or are you stepping over the lines of GDPR? And those issues have got to be addressed as we continue to use generative AI in our business environments. Fourth, review processing agreements. Now, these are the ones that you have in place with generative AI providers or with providers of the technology that might embed or use generative AI on their products. You review the contracts, you review the agreements, you review the understanding. Is the customer or the employees protected? Is the organization protected? Reviewing the processing agreements have everything to do with whether or not that information is in fact stable and secure in being used in generative AI models. Number five, and boy, is this a big one, and it touches all of us. If children data is in scope, ensure that you are prepared to support consent, collection from their parents or their guardians. That has to be on record. That has to be on file. Now, the issue always gets a little fuzzy from country to country because it's even different in Italy, possibly versus Germany versus England versus other Eastern European bloc countries, as well as African, as well as North American. But in some countries, the consent is 13. In some places, the age of consent is 16. Regardless, that information has to be kept and it has to be provided. And then it's important to build a funnel, a data collection to exclude the data from those that do not need to see it or that it's inappropriate. Pretty heady stuff, Rick, but the truth is we've got to take a look at this from a standpoint of not just, okay, here are the warnings of using generative AI. Here are the things that really it should not be combined with. But secondly, let's take a look over here and say, okay, understanding that generative AI is here to stay and growing because of, as we started this discussion, right, we talked about the advantages of generative AI, and they are significant for public and private sector. Now let's take a look at guidelines. Operationally, creating a framework in which generative AI can not only function within organizations, but can also cause that function or cause that organization to flourish if it's used correctly and it's functional.
Couple of great articles today, Thomas. In the first one, it's really clear that we're not going to stop AI. We're not going to slow it down.
Right.
But this could become a real mess if every country has its own regulations. Do you see an overall general set of best practices emerging here or not?
Right now, what I see is concern. As of this last week, there have been hearings been held in Washington, D.C. with lawmakers and with academicians and also with corporate leaders discussing the concerns and also discussing the potential of generative AI and what it can do. I think at this point, we see more concern. And I think that, honestly, Rick, I have to be honest with you when I say this. I think it's fantastic that we're finally starting to see more of a concern about the use of technology in our pervasive society. Are we using it correctly? Are we proliferating it correctly? Is it helping humanity or is it harming it? And I think that's something that is not only bipartisan, but global in the approach that needs to be taken to our next level of technology and what it's evolving to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Great show, Thomas. What's next?
Oh my gosh. Well, I think that maybe after we've talked so much about generative AI, we might take a break from that for just a little bit. And let's talk about business. Let's talk about retail. Let's talk about banking. Let's talk about financial services. And what's some of the investments that are being recommended by the analyst community and which ones they're not.
Awesome. We'll look forward to that next time. And I hope you join us on Walking the Virtual Dog.